And the next line in verse 2 is God's accusation. How long will you judge perversely, showing favor to the wicked? Now, if you are familiar with other biblical texts, and I'm thinking here of certainly other Psalms, but especially lots of prophetic texts. This is the classic prophetic complaint, right? You powerful kings and rulers in Judah and Samaria, you judge perversely, you show favor to the wicked, right? You don't take up the cause of the needy, right? This is the kind of language that we see sort of regularly, even and not just in prophetic texts, even in legal texts, right? And here it is addressed not as it is elsewhere to humans or to human judges who are being sort of unfair in their judgments, but in fact to the gods. A reminder that in the ancient Near East and the ancient world more generally, judgment and justice were understood to be divine characteristics. We've seen this already, back when we were talking about sort of the big themes of the Psalms. We talked about, these enthronement Psalms that really often have sort of God taking his seat in judgment and in ruling. Justice is supposed to be a divine characteristic that human judges and human kings emulate. So here, what's happening here is this is really becoming an issue of theodicy, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do you show favor to the wicked? Why do you judge perversely? That question of theodicy, right? Why do bad things happen to good people, or vice versa, is here understood to be a failure on the part of the deities, right? Whose job it is to ensure that justice prevails in the world. And evidently, they're not doing their jobs particularly well. So, this is taking this human language, right, of actual judging, right, and elevating it to the divine sphere. Things on earth seem to be happening perversely. These gods are failing in their main task, which is the upholding of justice. And of course, we should note, the irony is that God. Yahweh is here judging the other gods, right? So God stood up to judge in the divine council, right? He is judging the other gods on the basis of how badly they judge. And so again, we had the opening scene where we knew where we were. Now God is here in verse 2 addressing the other gods directly, right? He stands up in this divine council and he looks around and goes, "How long will you, plural? How long will you, plural, judge perversely?" And now he tells them, having said what they're doing badly, he says what they should be doing in verses 3 and 4. Judge the wretched and the orphan, vindicate the lowly and the poor, rescue the wretched and the needy, save them from the hand of the wicked. This is the third verse in a row that uses the word judge, the verb to judge. Each time differently. First, in the first verse, God stands up to judge. Then in the second verse, the gods are accused of judging perversely. And here they are instructed to judge correctly. Again, leaving no question in our mind, I think, about what the main theme of the psalm is. It's clearly justice. And there's a structure here that is not so dissimilar from one we saw, for example, last week with Psalm 29, or sort of like a set of three and then a fourth that varies a little bit. So you got here in verses 3 and 4, you've got three verbs: judge, vindicate, rescue, each time followed by a pair of objects that describes the vulnerable classes that are supposed to be cared for. Right? Judge, the wretched and the orphan; vindicate, the lowly and the poor; rescue, the wretched and the needy. And then a little switch at the end, a fourth verb, also like the same verb, right? Judge, vindicate, rescue, save, but now not with the people who need saving, but with a reference to the people who are actually oppressing, right? The hand of the wicked. Remember, in the previous verse, we also saw the wicked, right? The gods were showing favor to the wicked. Like how long will you show favor to the wicked? It said in the previous verse. And here we've got You should be saving the poor and the vulnerable and the wretched, the orphan and the lowly and the needy from the hand of those same wicked, using the same word, rishaim. Um, uh, you'll also perhaps notice here that you've got like, you've got this bodily image for the oppressors, right? In the verse before, in verse 2, the gods are literally lifting their faces. And here, that's the showing favor idiom. And here we're saving them from their hands, from the hands of the wicked. Um, there's we should. I always like to be attentive to the ways that biblical poetry, in particular, uses bodies and body language in really expressive ways, in a way that is, sort of grounds it more than I think the kind of lofty theological that we often assume. Okay, so God said, you guys are doing everything wrong. Here's what you should be doing. And now in verse 5, uh, he's clearly not talking to the accused anymore, because he's talking about them in the third person. They neither know nor understand. They go about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth totter. So having leveled the accusation directly to against the other gods, here it's like God, Yahweh, is turning to some jury and sort of like pointing at them and being like, look at these clowns. Who is this jury? Well, I mean, it may well be El, right? In whose counsel all this is happening, right? You've got the supreme deity, El, and you've got Yahweh and all of these other gods who are supposed to be actually carrying out on the earth justice. And it's like God turns to El, the great divine judge, and it's like, these gods fail at the basic skills of discernment necessary for correct judgment, right? They neither know nor understand. And then, again, actually using language that, if you are really familiar with a book like, say, Isaiah, this is Isaiah uses this language too, right? About Israel. Israel neither knows nor understands, right? Like they failed to see the divine plan. They're constantly screwing up. They neither see nor understand. They neither know nor understand. Isaiah will also say, right, they're blind, they're deaf, and that's similar stuff that's happening here, right? They go about in darkness, which is an idiom that is often associated directly with blindness, and also directly associated with laws against bribing judges, right? If you can hear in the back of your mind somewhere, right, in Exodus, it says, right, like you shall not, right, like you shall not take a bribe, because bribes, it says in Exodus, blind the clear-sighted, right? Bribery prohibits judges from seeing who's right and who's wrong, and that leads to precisely the perverse justice that we saw above in the accusation in verse 2. I will admit, this whole thing to me also, right? They neither know nor understand, and they walk about in darkness. Also, it rings to me like Genesis 3, right? With the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of which the serpent says will open Eve's eyes, right? The power of discernment. In that story, you also have God walking about, using this exact same verb for walking about. Just before we get to the judgment of Adam and Eve, I think there's lots of themes that are playing together. Again, I'm not actually suggesting that this psalm knows Genesis 3 or vice versa, but that both are partaking of a sort of a common set of language and concepts. In the last line here, right, all the foundations of the earth totter. Now, we have seen this. We've seen this language a couple of times in different ways. This is playing with this common tradition that links sort of the security of the world's foundations. I mean, I think literally, but also figuratively, with righteous, justice-filled divine rule, right? If the gods are carrying out justice correctly, the earth stands firm. As I suggested before, in other psalms, in sort of enthronement psalms especially, you see things like Yahweh takes his seat on his throne, often, enthroned above the flood, which we've seen before. And we get something like, and the world stands firm, it cannot be shaken, or it cannot be, it cannot be, I have handle in my head, it cannot be moved. So there's this link between justice and the earth not shaking, or between justice and the earth's firmness. And this is something that we see across the ancient Near East, right? When a king rules justly, the society is stable, and it's just expanded up into the divine realm. When the gods you know ensure that the world runs justly, then it stands firm. That's what royal divinity or divine kingship looks like. So here we've got like these gods who are supposed to be administering justice are failing, and the earth is therefore tottering. Uh, but it's also playing wonderfully, I think, with the line before, right? The imagery of like they go about in darkness, right? Like the idea like these deities are actually physically stumbling around, like causing the earth to shake. Um, so there's all this wonderful imagery going on. Okay, that's the accusation toward the judge, and now comes the judgment, which I think God also delivers. Um, this is I think Yahweh acting is like what is that terrible TV show? Like Jag, right? Like whatever the thing is where you get to like make the case and also deliver the verdict. That's like that's like what God's doing here. God says, this is what they're doing. This is what you're doing. This is what they're doing. Okay, here comes the judgment here in verses 6 and 7. I had taken you for divine beings, sons of the Most High, all of you. But you shall die as men do, fall like any prince. Um, and I will tell you, you can tell this from reading the transliteration here, but the opening line here is almost every word starts the same way. Ani, Amarti, Elohim, Atem, Ubene, Elyon, all of you, Kulchem. So there's like there's this I don't know, the repetition of that ah sound at the beginning sort of like is like a hammer of the accusation. So what's the upshot? The accusation is basically like God is saying, like you are your job, right? You are God's, and your job is to uphold justice. And if you fail to do your job, you will simply cease to be what you once were, right? You used to be gods, right? You were all the sons of Elyon, right? Elyon is a name we've seen before, right? That's the word for Most High, which is another title in Canaanite religion for El, that chief deity in whose council we're sitting, and which comes into the Bible as El Elyon, God Most High. So you used to all these gods were understood to be the offspring of Elyon, this chief deity. But if you fail to uphold justice, you've essentially given up that position. Now you're going to die. You're going to fall like a human, right? Like any old prince, right? And there that word at the end, right? The prince, right? Like here's that royal sense again that we saw before with like the kings upholding justice. Even maybe here, like you're gonna die like a prince, almost brings in this notion of like a coup is happening here, right? These princes are falling because they have been overthrown, right? They were incapable of ruling, and Yahweh is like, all right, if you can't do it, I'm gonna have to take over for you. What it turns out we have here is like a poetic myth about the downfall of all the other gods, um, which results at the end with Yahweh, Israel's God, being like the preeminent, right? The one who is in fact ruling the earth in justice. It's not monotheistic in that sense, because the other gods clearly are out there. They've just been sort of, I don't know, dethroned from their position. And the final line, right? So if this was the judgment, the final line of the poem isn't spoken by God. It's not spoken by the narrator, like in verse 1. It's not spoken by El or Elyon, who's sitting there. It's not spoken by the other deities. It seems like this last line, I think, is spoken by us. like by the audience, like the people who are watching the scene, sort of as a chorus. Um, and what does it say? Arise, O God, judge the earth. And see how that word arise recalls for us the very beginning of the poem, where God stands up in the divine assembly. And now we call on Yahweh, to arise and to judge, just as, right, he's already been judging, right? That's what it said in verse 1. He took his stand to judge in the divine council. So now we're calling on God to judge, but not to judge the divine assembly, to judge the earth, right? He's done with the judging there. That's done. Now it's his job, right? Like he said, you guys all were terrible at this, so I guess I'm gonna have to do it. So now we're saying, okay, do it. Judge the earth, take over their responsibilities, which was logically what was going to happen. I'm reminded this, I must admit, this reminds me of like a faculty meeting where I have learned over long and extensive experience that if you say that something's not going the way it ought to be, you are put in charge of fixing it, which is why in faculty meetings, one should never speak. But okay, so Yahweh hadn't learned that yet. He gets up, he complains. He's now given the job. Okay, you think you're the competent one? Fine. So arise, O God, judge the earth. Right, remember that earth, the same earth that we were told was tottering for lack of judgment earlier. For all the nations are your possession. And this is a wonderful conclusion because it feels, in a sense, like it comes out of nowhere. But if we are familiar, again, with sort of broader ancient Near Eastern, especially Canaanite mythology, suddenly it makes sense. I think I talked about this in a previous session, but there's a myth that runs sort of as a very an almost invisible thread through much of the Hebrew Bible. A myth that is originally Canaanite, in which Elyon, the chief deity, whom we've met already, apportioned the people and gods to each territory. So so that the I don't know, whatever, the Moabites, he was like, all right, Moabites, I'm putting you in this place, Moab, and your God will be Chemosh. And like those things go together. Now the Moabites have their land and their deity, and they're all tied up in one thing. And that's this Canaanite myth of how did everybody end up in their own place with their own deities? This is how Elyon apportioned them. And part of that story is, and Israel is the possession of Yahweh, right? Like Israel is Yahweh's people and land. And that seems to be the myth that's alluded to here. In the same, and here it's being expanded, right? Once the gods have failed at justice, now Yahweh is not just in charge of Israel, but all the nations, right? Yahweh has to judge the whole earth. And so Yahweh now gets all of the peoples as his possession. But so in other words, it's like it's like part two to that creation myth. We have apportioned all the people, all the nations among the various gods. And it turned out, well, it didn't work so well. So now it turns out Yahweh's going to take over and set things right. Anyway, as I said, it's a kind of a wild psalm because there's really not another one like it. It's not a psalm that is obviously spoken by an individual, right? So it's not like an individual lament or a psalm of thanksgiving. It's not a communal hymn. It's really like it's a little scene. It's a little script. It's a little bit of mythology poeticized for us. And it is so deeply Canaanite in a way that I hope I think is clear on the surface with El and Elyon and the council of the deities and the mythology and like but it's Canaanite to the extent that this is one psalm. There are others, including Psalm 29 that we read last week, that some scholars have been like, this psalm is so Canaanite that I think it was originally, in fact, a piece of Canaanite poetry. Like, and instead of Elohim as the like main character, it was probably Baal. Right? This may well have been a Canaanite poem about Baal taking over in the divine council, and then Israel sort of took it over and replaced Baal with the more generic Elohim. it's possible. I don't think it matters much, and there's no way of ever knowing. But the point, the reason that comes up is because this is really like this doesn't feel like the kind of thing you'd expect to find in the Bible, right? It is so manifestly acknowledges polytheism as a thing, even as it's sort of suggesting that our God is better than all the other gods. A council of deities that are supposed in a perfect world would be doing their jobs correctly. Very not standard sort of classic biblical stuff. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's such a fantastic, interesting, weird, and also again beautifully poetic, repetitive, words that come back and themes that recur, and it pulls on the judging, and the opening line and the last line really tie the whole thing. It's beautifully done.